For the last 7 years, I have continued to build the narrative globally for what cannabis can be in food and beverage. Most people perceive it to be gummies, brownies, and cookies. And I'm telling you that I make gummies, brownies, and cookies. My brownies have avocado. My cookies have 3 ingredients. And, like my gummies are vegan and gluten-free and dairy-free and refined sugar-free. So I came to cannabis at a very young age, but professionally realized that a lot of people need help. And like me, can find their health through food, which cannabis is. Cannabis is just another great ingredient that I use.
This is the Cannabis Enigma, cutting through the smoke to have informed, serious conversations for regular people.
Hi, I'm Alana Goldberg.
And I'm Dr. Cody Peterson.
And today, Cody, we get to talk about 2 of our favorite topics, cannabis and food.
Those are almost the same topic in my mind. Almost.
Do you consume cannabis or food?
Is there all of the above?
Yes, there is. There definitely is.
I think what's cool about cannabis and food is cannabis is food. In fact, one of the earliest uses of cannabis was for its seeds to eat. Far before humans figured out that you could smoke cannabis, they figured out that you could consume its seeds and use its fiber.
Yeah, far before humans figured out how to order pizza.
I think now with the advent of Uber Eats, we're not limited to pizza delivery anymore. Okay, don't put us in that pizza box.
Well, not everyone has Uber Eats, Cody.
I guess I'm privileged.
You are indeed, in many ways. So content about cannabis and cooking has been really popular on the Enigma at the moment. We've noticed an increased interest in recipes, in kind of how-tos about decarboxylation, about different devices that are used in the cannabis kitchen. So definitely a growing kind of interest topic. So this is why we decided to invite Chef Jordan Wagman onto the show. And this was another one of these interviews where Cody and I were fighting about who got to interview him. So we decided to interview him together. Tell us a bit about Jordan, Cody.
Well, you'll hear in the interview that I met Jordan digitally, as many of my cannabis connections started. And what's interesting is he was touting his favorite recipe. And again, you'll hear this in the episode. It was fruit leather. And everyone
Right.
was raving about the fruit leather. But I had to comment that, the animal hide made from fruit doesn't really sound appeasing to me. And he disagreed, and we had it out around that. And I asked if it was tanned, before you ate it or not. But the point is we laughed at each other. And interestingly enough, 6 months later, we find ourselves, in the same room as Alana here, talking about how Jordan, can come on the podcast and how he can even maybe help work with us on some recipes and, work with the Enigma.
Yeah, so Jordan's going to be helping us to beef up our recipe section, pun intended. And I think one of the things that's really great about Jordan's story, and again, we're not going to do too many spoilers here. Yeah, welcome. Cody's been working all night. So if he says anything weird, just ignore it.
Oh, night shift.
Yeah. So Jordan, like so many other people that are kind of pushing forward in the cannabis industry, has his own story with the plant and about how he realized that it was helping with his psoriasis from a very young age. So that's, a lot of the kind of passion behind his work. And he talks about that in the interview. And we're hoping that Jordan's going to make it over to Israel at some point this year to do a 14-course cannabis-infused meal for the Enigma team as well.
I'm going to have to make the trip to Israel specifically for that day. But seriously, Jordan has been really fun to talk to. He's really a genuine person who is super excited to share his knowledge about cannabis and food with the world. And, he's really got this beautiful story about healing with cannabis, as so many people do. So, check out the interview and you will get to learn more about Jordan. And then obviously, if you want to read more about his content and things, you can always find his name on the Enigma.
Absolutely, and we'll pop that in the show notes for you as well. We're going to go straight to the interview now, and stick around after the interview. We've got our regulation segment with our co-producers at Americans for Safe Access. So yeah, remember to have a listen. All right, let's talk about food and cannabis. Who's up for it?
These are two of my favorite things, usually one before the other, but if you can put them together, I'm down for that as well.
One before the other, and then the other, and then the other, and then back and forth, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's like a teeter-totter.
What about you, Jordan?
I'm curious which comes before which. I'm not sure. Is it the cannabis before the food or the food before the cannabis? I'm uncertain.
It's a chicken before the egg sort of thing.
Welcome
to the podcast, Chef Jordan Wagman. He is a cannabis and food expert in one, and we're excited to have him on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. So, Jordan, I'd love it if we could just start off hearing your story. How did you end up being a cannabis chef?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I talk about the quote unquote cannabis chef often, which I don't think I am. And I'll sort of, I'll start here that, I was diagnosed with psoriasis at the age of 12. I call it the Corey Hart years. I wear my sunglasses at night. And so, I had spiked hair just like Corey Hart. And I woke up one day at my friend's house, and I woke up with basically 3 huge patches of psoriasis on my hair. And because I had spiked hair, 2 of these patches were positioned right at the front of my scalp, and all the hair clumped together to form what looked like basically 2 horns coming out of my head, which was, apropos, seeing as though my father thought I was a little bit of a devil's child, which I was. But after that, finding psoriasis and being diagnosed, every decision I made in my life revolved around my health, specifically my skin. When I wrote every high school exam in the hospital, I ended up spending a year and a half of my life sleeping in a tent at the Dead Sea in Israel, and ultimately finding what I call the first piece to my health puzzle, which was the sunshine. The sun reduced my skin production and allowed me to maintain relative health until I got on the plane, went back to Toronto, got off the plane, and my psoriasis started to come back. So, after spending a lot of time in Israel and finding that, first piece, I subsequently sought, the sunshine wherever I was. So every vacation I took was always, to an island or to sunshine, and ultimately moved to Florida to go to culinary school, and California. And believe it or not, it's sunny every day in Colorado, even though it's cold sometimes. So I was always seeking out the sunshine, thinking that it was the only way to heal myself. The parallel is, while I was, after my diagnoses, what I found at a very young age and was labeled stoner, pothead, and burnout was that I smoked pot every day since I was 12 because it allowed me to go to sleep. I'd go for psoriasis treatments. I'd get burnt in UVB, whatever it was. I'd wake up in the middle of the night in a psoriasis flare, and smoking cannabis allowed me to go to sleep. So I never fully appreciated at a young age that cannabis was being used for health and wellness. I just assumed, as I say often, it was because I loved the Grateful Dead, played guitar, and had a ponytail. Fast forward to 7 years ago, having had, a lifetime in culinary and hospitality, and, being very involved in food on a daily basis, I was ready to make holistic changes to my diet and sought the help of a naturopath. And from this one meeting, I removed gluten, dairy, and refined sugar from my diet and began consuming cannabis. Within 60 days, I lost 30 pounds, and my psoriasis improved dramatically and almost went away. For the last 7 years, I have continued to build the narrative globally for what cannabis can be in food and beverage. Most people perceive it to be gummies, brownies, and cookies, and I'm telling you that I make gummies, brownies, and cookies. My brownies have avocado. My cookies have 3 ingredients. And, like my gummies are vegan and gluten-free and dairy-free and refined sugar-free. So I came to cannabis at a very young age, but professionally realized that a lot of people need help. And like me, can find their health through food, which cannabis is. Cannabis is just another great ingredient that I use.
Wow, Jordan, you shared a lot about your journey here, and it sounds like, I think it's interesting that you've been battling psoriasis, with different tools through your life, eventually finding, or maybe leaning on cannabis as a crutch. And now what you've done is you've taken food and diet, and you've elevated your endocannabinoid system, continue to use cannabis medicinally, and it sounds like you're finding some tremendous success.
Continued health benefits, no question about it. I think for me, and I always talk about, I learned that the phrase, we are an end of one from Dr. Deb Kimless, we're an end of one. And so for me, I know that food and cannabis works to help to keep my inflammation in check. But I'll be honest, it's really the removal of the refined sugar, I believe. Again, we're an end of one. But I believe that the removal of refined sugar has impacted my body as much as the benefits of cannabis, to be honest.
I mean, certainly that's what we want from you, is honesty. And I think, there's a lot of dietary changes that we could look to make, and we've gone through a lot of diets, but there's no doubt that sugar intake has increased in recent times. And cannabis too, like when we look at cannabis edibles, for example, these are very sugar-rich products. And whether that's a problem or whether they shouldn't be there, I'm obviously a proponent of allowing all products to exist in the consumer marketplace. But I do think that we're underserving the health-conscious consumer right now in the cannabis edibles space.
I agree with you, and balance is important. I use my Oreo cookie example sometimes to sort of highlight balance. A good friend of mine growing up wasn't allowed to eat Oreos for whatever reason. We'd go to summer camp and his duffel bag would be filled with Oreos. Because we weren't allowed food, he'd take them out, he'd take them to the woods, he'd dig this hole, and he'd bury the Oreos in the duffel bag so that he had this stash all summer long. Why? Because throughout the year, he wasn't allowed to have it. I don't forbid my children from having anything. We don't have soda in the house. We don't have crunchy bars or sugar cereals in the house. Do I know my kids eat McDonald's? Of course I do. But life is about balance. The issue I have in the edible space, food and beverage, let's just, blanket it, food and beverage, is there's no balance. So it's all the same products. If you go and you take a look at the gummies, for example, that are available, what differentiates one from the next? Maybe it's a flavor profile. Maybe it's the mold they use, right? Maybe some are big, maybe some are small, maybe some are stars, ponies, whatever the case may be, shapes and sizes. But the health benefits, there's no differentiation with ingredients. So it's the same. Refined sugar, and here's sort of the premise that I build all of my culinary experiences on. Cannabis combined with refined sugar. When you eat that gummy, you're the science guy, so you'll correct me, but there's no doctor that I've spoken with and discussed this at length that has argued the validity of this theory. The refined sugar wants to be absorbed in your body before the cannabis. Your body loves sugar. Now don't put sugar in that cannabis food stuff. What is your body going to absorb? Inevitably, it makes your cannabis much more bioavailable if you're pairing it with other ingredients that are not refined sugar. So when people come for 15
particularly
courses,
fats, right?
100%.
Right.
But when people come for 15 course infused experiences with me, they come in and they're all heroes. Everyone's a hero. I eat 100 milligrams, I eat 150, and I say, good for you. You're going to come in and you're going to have the experience the way that I curate it, which is over 15 courses. You may have maximum 20 milligrams of THC. But I'm combining it with tons of terpenes, tons of raw flower, tons of minor cannabinoids to create that whole flower experience, which we call that entourage effect. Mm-hmm. And every single person, no matter who you are, your experience in cannabis, new, old, experienced, whatever the case may be, every person leaves saying the same thing. This was the most incredible food experience I've ever had. Because they appreciate that they had something that they've never experienced before, because all food is so filled with sugar and other junk. So That's my soapbox.
Well, how do I get a ticket? Like, sign me up for that 15-course meal. What were you going to say, Alana?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I want to get you, on the air agreeing to do this 15-course meal next time we come to Israel for the team. I know you actually already agreed the last time we spoke.
I've already agreed. I already told my family, listen, I don't know when, but just expect that I may ask you to pick me up from the airport. And like 17 of them were like, No problem. So
Okay, very good.
wait.
So I'm glad we have that settled. I would love it, Jordan, if we can kind of jump into talking about some tips for people who are cooking at home. What are the basics? What do people need to know if they want to start experimenting with making their own edibles?
I talk about something called a repeatable experience. And I want those. I think the biggest challenge that we have are, newcomers to cannabis. How do we get them to understand the benefits, then have an experience, enjoy the experience, and then want that second experience? That's the goal, is getting them to the second experience. I'm going to take for granted they love the first experience. We're getting them here. Well, if they get to the second experience and it differs drastically from the first, they're gone. You're never getting them back. We need to create safer environments when we're cooking cannabis for clients, for anyone. Creating that repeatable experience is about creating homogeneous mixtures. So what do? You can, of course, you can take your dropper with distillate and put a dollop on it, or whatever, a milliliter, and there's 20 milligrams in that milliliter, and you have 20 milligrams in there. Sure, you can individually dose your food stuff. Absolutely, you can. That's not cooking with cannabis. That's just adding cannabis to your food. Cooking with cannabis is different. Creating an ice cream mixture, like let's talk sorbet, a blueberry sorbet mixture. I will bring blueberries and maple syrup to a boil, covered. As soon as the blueberry skins split and start to release all of those juices, guess what? It's done. You bring that down to room temperature. Why? Because if I don't want to infuse my cannabinoids into a very hot product. There's no reason to. I'm going to freeze this anyways. I bring it down to room temperature. I put it into a blender and I add my distillate. The reason I personally am adding a purchased distillate is because I know the exact potency to do decimal places of the cannabinoids per milliliter, whatever the unit of measure is. So again, I'll use the example. If I want to add 20 milligrams to this sorbet mixture, I add 1 milliliter, there's 20 milligrams in there, I puree. Agitate, the RPMs are high enough, creating this emulsification, which is combining two ingredients that don't normally mix, right? We're creating this homogeneous, very smooth mixture. Think Caesar dressing, think mayonnaise. Those are emulsions, right? They're emulsifications. Then I'll put it into my ice cream mixture. And now I will simply take the yield, divide it by my portion size, and that is the quantity of, or potency of cannabis per serving size.
Per dose, right? And so really what you're getting at is it's really important to make sure that all of your cannabis oil or product is well immersed. Just dropping it into, let's say, the red sauce on your pot kitchen is not going to work, is what you're telling me.
No, it won't, because one spoonful will have no cannabinoids, one spoonful will have all the cannabinoids or some of the cannabinoids. You're always going to have a tolerance.
Somebody gets the short straw, somebody gets the good straw.
Someone is left out. So let me summarize that by saying, the tip for anyone that's going to create food stuff in their kitchen is to purchase your cannabinoids. If you are not familiar with the decarboxylation process and you don't really have access to sending out your finished infusion to a lab to tell you the actual potency of that cannabinoid, you as a producer of product for a paying customer, and I'm speaking to professional chefs out there, you're being irresponsible. You're better off in your home environment or cooking for others to buy something where you can appreciate the efficacy of that finished product.
I mean, I can appreciate that. If you're serving other people, right? If you're serving other people, you want to know what dose you have. That makes complete sense to me, Jordan.
What about for people who are, living in a place where they can't just buy a tincture or a distillate so easily?
Well, we had a conversation, Alana, Cody, and I, about an amazing feature that's coming out, and I hope you don't mind me talking about it. Jeff the 420 Chef came out with this calculator many years ago, and people find it extremely useful. there's no question that there is a benefit to a calculator that can help you create or understand the potency of your cannabis. So that is the answer, is you have to learn how to create these infusions yourself as a responsible manner that you can. Using a calculator, which you're going to feature, will allow those people to create as close to a product that I'm subscribing to them on their own. So
yeah, I think that's kind of where we stand in this challenged market, right? Because there was so much stifling of knowledge and technology and development. We've got all these people who are producing cannabis, have long been infusing, and are very comfortable infusing cannabis at home for themselves, right? And I think, for those folks, we should still encourage them to do so. But I agree, particularly when you're dealing with a party or a group, individuals who aren't comfortable with cannabis, you want to be really, really important on that dose. And then this emulsification, this is super intriguing. You see this with our gummies recipe on the Enigma, which is one of our popular ones. We use gelatin, but also soy lecithin, right? Or lecithin in general, it doesn't have to be soy, as an emulsifier, right? So this is an interesting thing. When you take water, right, like as in gummies, and then you want it to blend with your cannabis oil, you actually need this in between, this lecithin, and I'm sure that you use lecithin in your cooking.
Never.
Or I shouldn't say that. What do you use in lieu of that as an emulsifier?
Nothing. It's all technique. It's all culinary. So you're combining. My signature sauce has 2 ingredients: cherry tomatoes and olive oil. The same premise with the blueberries applies. You take the 2 ingredients, you put them in a pot, you cover it. You wait until the skins split. They release all the water. So it was a dry mixture. And now ultimately what you're looking for is all the water will cover those tomatoes. You put them in something with high enough RPMs, and you're suspending that water in the oil, right? And so you're creating that natural emulsification. So you can suspend them. Now, can you do that with a whisk? No. And so that's the point, is that if someone doesn't have, when I say technique, equipment comes into play with technique. I just want to speak to one thing that you mentioned insofar as those that are creating those infusions on their own today. In truth, Cody, they're not the ones that I'm speaking to. The ones that I'm speaking to are the ones that are new to cannabis, because the ones that are already creating, we're the outliers. We're not the norm. The norm are the people that are not in cannabis.
Right. Most people haven't done this yet.
Exactly. So it's for those people that are creating their own infusions, have at it. It's working for them. I can't do that for clients. I feel more responsible. I think it's more responsible if I'm buying something. I'm more trying to appeal to those that are, sitting at home. They're really confused as to whether cannabis is right for them or not. And in truth, it's all about, as the 3 of us do on a daily basis, having these conversations to help remove the stigma. And it's a much easier conversation when you're talking to people about cannabis consumption over food than handing them a package of zigzags and some flour and say, go roll a joint. No one's going to do that.
It's a totally different experience too, and that's so important, right? The duration is longer, the come up is much slower, and for some folks, they find it much more enjoyable. And this has to do with their individual metabolism. We have articles on the Enigma about this, why some individuals don't feel edibles or feel very little compared to others who feel them very intensely. And these can be genetic differences and all sorts of science fun. So if that's something that intrigues you, there's an article on that as well on the website.
Yeah, I want to circle back, Jordan. You mentioned tools. You mentioned that, it comes down to the tools that you have in your kitchen. What are the must-haves when it comes to kind of building an amateur cannabis kitchen?
So it's funny. The blender is number one, a very good blender that can get, your RPMs up pretty high. I do have an immersion blender that I use, but which is just, the stick that with the blade on the end that you can submerge into a pot or whatever the case may be. And you can just sort of, blend it using this immersion blender. The problem is that the immersion blender, it doesn't create that same sort of level of emulsification as a proper blender. And plus, because it doesn't get the RPMs as high, or the RPMs don't get as high, it's still, there's some fibers left. It's not as smooth texturally. So when you're creating these emulsifications, these sauces, these desserts, these chocolate bases, these ice cream bases, you want texturally to be very smooth. So I think number one is a really, really good blender. Then measuring cups. I mean, measuring spoons. It's really as simple as that. And I always have a dropper in milliliters so that I know per milliliter how much cannabis I'm putting in.
Really good tips, and I think a good blender is a great kitchen tool whether you're cooking with cannabis or not. But I do totally agree. That's a great tip as to just something the average person, if they're looking to make a Christmas upgrade or whatnot, then they can lean towards that. So perfect. What about a favorite recipe? Do you have something that you love? Is this your blueberries that you were sharing with us?
I mean, one of my, my signature, my new book is coming out 4/20. That's the plan. And so one of the signatures in that book is my fruit leather, which is essentially the same recipe as creating the blueberry puree for the ice cream mixture, but I pour it out on a parchment paper lined baking sheet and dehydrate it, at 95 degrees for 20 hours, or put it in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours. But it creates incredible fruit leather. I know you don't love the name, but fruit roll-ups, that sort of thing. But it's dehydrated fruit, and for me, where I love to eat my cannabis, it really is such a, on the go type of food stuff for me, because it can sit shelf stable for truly years and years and years. There's no moisture, there's no nothing in it. So my fruit leather, number one, far and away.
Oh, man, I'm going to have to try it. Jordan's referencing, as some of you may know, we're on social media. It's how we got connected to Jordan. And everyone was rocking the fruit leather. And I had to come out and say, I'm like, I don't know, like processed animal hide fruit made out of fruit. I don't know.
What does this mean? Everyone was rocking the fruit leather.
Like everyone was like, oh, this looks so great. And I was like, it looks good, but we could consider a new name.
I don't know if you had growing up, we had roll-ups, these little
exactly.
leather guys that we had in our play lunch. That's what we called it in Australia.
Is that like a school lunch?
You can call
something
it
like that. I don't know. It's the one you do at like 10 or 11 in the morning. Play lunch. I
love those.
It's very weird.
Love them. I mean, honestly, that and like jujubes or wine gums, those sort of textures, I love chewing on them. Like I loved fruit roll-ups growing up. And I'll be honest, so with the fruit leather, like it's so experiential, and that's why I love it so much, right? So if you think about your regular experience with a gummy, for example, you open up the package and you pop a gummy, but tearing the leather away from the paper on the back is so reminiscent, Alana,
so
of exactly what you just outlined. It's so awesome. It always puts a smile on my face just tearing those apart from one another.
Yeah, I totally get that. So I got to ask, I have been known to say things like, why don't you people just smoke a joint and order a pizza like a normal person? And Jordan's nodding. He's like, yeah, I know you people, you joint and pizza people.
He's like, you actually said that to me before, is what he just said.
Probably have. But I guess my question is, does it matter what different foods? We talked about sugars and fats beforehand, but does it matter what different food you're ingesting the cannabis with, or is it just the simple fact of like the oral ingestion method?
So for me, and I'll always defer to, I always stay in my lane, but I can tell you based on experience, because the cannabinoids are already in a fat, they're already there. That's what they've bonded to, right? No matter what I'm using, they're already in that fat. So once I distribute that fat equally in creating that homogeneous mixture we've talked about, then no, because they're already in the fruit leather. But I will say, when I eat my brownies, for example, and I love my brownies, there's avocado and coconut oil and cacao and maple syrup, but really good fats in there. If I serve someone who typically eats 50 milligrams, a 3 or 4 milligram brownie filled with my avocado and good fats, they get high. They absolutely feel it. So I will answer you from an experiential standpoint, and I'd love to hear Cody's answer. But yes, it does to an extent. Because the fat's already there, I can get away with it and create fruit roll-ups. But it does make a difference when I'm pairing that cannabis with other good fats. It does.
Yeah, I mean, it's
so
an
Cody's
interesting
been making
concept.
squinting faces.
I mean, look, I'm a pharmacologist, right? And anything that would suggest tenfold difference in potency would make me a little bit skeptical. I can get behind the idea that delivering cannabinoids in this format, the brownie format, can definitely increase bioavailability. That's well established. It also increases duration of the response to cannabis, even compared to like an edible, a gummy type of a higher dose. But your range is skeptical. But there's a lot going on here that's very complex about how the body processes fats, how it uptakes them, and then where it sends them, whether it burns them for energy right away or whether it sends it through the system to the liver for storage and all sorts of other stuff. So extremely complex stuff. And we need to learn more. These studies are still just barely being done into cannabis and bioavailability. And what we know so far has mostly been based on drug studies spraying, Sativex into people's mouths, for these MS studies around the world. So we have a long way to go before we can make those claims. But certainly I can see how you could get more potency out of delivering cannabis with this nice natural fat that is very bioavailable. There's my squint. That's why I was squinting.
All right. Thank you for clarifying. Let's go on to talk a little bit about consumption lounges and cannabis restaurants and like the kind of new frontier that is ahead of us. Jordan, how do you kind of plan on getting in on the game, if at all, or how does it change the space for you?
I've said many times that I will not own a restaurant. I'm done. I can't do that anymore. And this is the but when cannabis comes online, I'm in. Yesterday, I received a phone call. Someone, very well known is working on something, and would I consider? And of course, the answer is yes, of course. But we have a long way to go. And so education is at the forefront of getting us to where we need to go. I think that consumption lounges are huge. I think they're a step in the right direction. I think there needs to be, again, I will say till I'm blue in the face, that there needs to be good education out there so that we can continue, just like we do with the Smart Serve, and we're creating a safer environment for bartenders. How do we create that same environment for people so that they don't green out, so they don't consume too much cannabis, so that we create that safe environment? Right? There needs to be that type of certification and education available for those out there. So I think there's a top-down and bottom-up approach here. Creatively, it's a no-brainer, and I can see it. And I can also see the evolution of it as I've discussed it. I think that if you consider an infusing station, if you can sort of conceptualize this, people can take it by all means. I hope more and more people do. But I see that the evolution being that there's a dispensary next door to a consumption lounge. You can probably, and again, I'm just talking about step one. You can go next door, buy your cannabis, bring it here, give it to me behind the counter. I will watch you infuse, or you will watch me infuse. And that's sort of what it is. Maybe that evolves to buying the cannabis, bringing it to the chef, and they infuse it. Whatever the case may be, this is mainstream. It's going to continue becoming more mainstream. Janet Zuccarello just opened up Gusto Green in LA. Now, they're not serving, as to the best of my knowledge, they're not serving cannabis right now, but their intention is to serve cannabis, would be my guess. So this is coming. People are talking about it. We're talking about it here. I can tell you that there's some really exciting things that you should keep your ear to the ground for. Well, now that we're so well connected, I'll share with you at some point. But there's some really exciting news in Canada from the hospitality, from a catering cannabis standpoint that's going to be released in the next little while, which again starts this evolution towards full consumption, 5-star restaurant.
Well, that lines up with really one of the core values of the Enigma, which is destigmatization and normalization, right? We want to bridge the gap with knowledge, understanding of, these emulsions and the ins and outs of all of these issues. So I completely agree. This is the next step. I'm glad to hear Canada's making a move. West Hollywood here in Southern California is making a big push to become this new go-to place for these sort of consumption lounges. And I really look forward to the creativity that the cannabis industry is so well known for, finding its way into these experiences, because Lord knows they're going to make experiences out of the whole idea. What's your favorite thing that you've ever done on weed? Like this sort of joke that can now actually be brought to fruition. So I think it's a really exciting time for cannabis.
Yeah, definitely.
I couldn't agree more.
And I can't wait to try one of your infused anything. All your compotes and your healthful recipes got me hungry. I'm thinking about what I have in the house, and I'm like, I think I just have sugar cereal.
Throw it out.
Me, the challenge is that most people don't appreciate that the future of food is not sweet. The future of cannabis food stuff, it's not sweet. It's savory. We're talking about buying Tetra packs or shelf-stable, tomato soups and teas. And, it's frustrating here in Canada, and I can't speak to it today, but when I was doing my research, I couldn't even purchase teas in Ontario, cannabis teas, void of refined sugar. So, for me, there's going to be 2 steps. One step towards savory food stuff, and the other towards, which I believe we're already sort of motioning this way, is towards health and wellness.
Yeah, well, that's the cannabis in general is finding itself smack bang in the middle of that health and wellness space across the board, not just in terms of edibles.
And if you look at the industry today, certainly there's part of the industry, particularly the CBD market, and then this sort of adult use market has really leaned towards THC. And I think we're going to find a confluence where these all sort of come and blend together, and cannabis kind of leaves this idea of being bifurcated into these 2 market segments. But anyway,
the middle path.
Yeah, the confluence. I love it.
That's it. All right. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time today. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and very much looking forward to your relatives picking you up from the airport and bringing you straight to the Enigma offices. We'll see if we can get you to come and join Cody when we make this big party happen.
We got to make a Enigma apron for Jordan, like with Buddy on the apron.
A Buddy apron. Okay, we're going to do it.
All right, we're doing it.
I love it. Listen, I have to tell you, and I can't wait to have you on my show, but so I can ask you all my down and dirty questions. But I have to tell you and pay you both an incredible compliment that, with all of the content that's out there today, Enigma does one of the best jobs, if not the best job, curating really informative content. And it's really well done. And I told you both offline that the experience on your platform is phenomenal. So congrats on what you're building and continuing to build. It's really well done.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very kind words. Thank you so much.
Jordan,
thanks for having me.
Where can our listeners find you if they want to get in touch with you or kind of learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, everywhere. Chef Jordan Wagman on social media. Please follow, subscribe, and like to In the Weeds, which is a food first podcast, which, these 2 rock stars will be on in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, Chef Jordan Wagman anywhere and everywhere.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Jordan.
We'll see you in the weeds, Jordan.
In the weeds.
Bye, buddy.
All right, enough puns. Goodbye.
Never enough puns.
All right, so for our ACER segment today, we've got something a little bit different. I have here with me William Dolphin, who has been involved with ACER since the beginning, kind of working on a number of different things through the years, focused around legal cases, policy, and research. And currently, you might recognize William's name from the monthly newsletter that ACER puts out every month, obviously, because it's a monthly newsletter. Thanks for joining me here today, William.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. So William was actually just telling me before we started recording about some interesting work that he's been involved in on this intersection of cannabis and mental health. So we decided to dedicate our segment this week to kind of unpacking this super important and I think really misunderstood topic. Why don't you jump straight into it, William?
Yeah, thanks. It has been really interesting digging a little further into this. The intersection of mental health and cannabis use is super important, and it is an area where there is some of the most dramatic difference between what doctors say about cannabis and what people who use cannabis experience with it. I became interested in this because of research that my partner, Michelle Newhart, and I did in Colorado with a patient experience there, and folks reporting that they were using cannabis to manage mental health. And in my years with ASA, I've heard other folks report that as well. And as I began investigating a little bit further, I discovered just how radically different the views of the psychiatric profession are about cannabis use and patients. Worldwide, mental health management is one of the top 3 reasons that people use cannabis medicinally. But almost all psychiatrists will tell you that if you've got any kind of mental health issue, you shouldn't use it. And even if you don't, you're risking mental health problems if you do, including a risk of psychosis. And this has been getting a lot of attention in the press over the last several years. There's been an explosion in the scientific literature. The number of articles concerned with psychosis in cannabis have just skyrocketed over the last 20 years. And it's not that we've come to any sort of new discoveries about it. The one thing that it really correlates to is the spread of legal access and the increased concerns on the side of the medical community about what that might entail.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say this because I hear this echoed from specialties across the board of, often in the psychiatric space, but also neurologists. I hear this a lot that they started treating before they had any kind of training in cannabis, and they saw cannabis use as a comorbidity. They saw, I've heard this through physicians who are treating autism spectrum disorder, who are treating Tourette's, actually some fascinating research from, I'm sure you're aware of her work, Dr. Kirsten Muller-Wahl in Germany, who realized that huge percentages of her patients were actually self-medicating with cannabis. And when she was able to kind of look at it through the lens of understanding what her patients, or rather kind of learning from her patients rather than looking to teach her patients, she saw that this was actually, medication that she could get involved in and help make the treatment more effective rather than simply looking at it as a second disease or a second indication that was presenting.
Right. Or a causal factor, right? That's what we see with cannabis on the psychiatry side, because one of the things that is super interesting on this comorbidity question is that folks with psychiatric disorders, and to be clear, schizophrenia is the one that gets all the attention, right? Right. Psychiatry has always been super concerned with it. It's, a long history around that, but it's not even clear that they understand what it is. There's no clear sense of how it comes to be in people, but people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia are way more likely to be pretty serious users of cannabis, right? And so that's been used to say, well, look, there's this linkage. And then the other thing they point to is, well, on the self-medication thing, because that's been a theory out there, they say, well, it can't be that. Because if you look, the cannabis use precedes the diagnosis of schizophrenia almost always. And so that time thing tells us that caused the other. Well, the problem with that is that
the symptoms, I suppose, that's the question.
Right. You reached a threshold of diagnosis, but that didn't mean that you were perfectly fine before that. Right? There's a prodromal syndrome where you're beginning to feel funny, feel off, and cannabis is enormously helpful with what they call the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, the anxiety, the depression. Again, the top reasons people use it to manage mental health. And one of the things that's super interesting as they've gotten a little bit farther, there have been a couple of case studies where they had intractable patients, right? Not responding, refractory, they call it, not responding to any kind of medication, institutionalized, non-functional. But these were folks who reported that they had used a lot of cannabis before they were institutionalized, and they found that it helped their symptoms. So some guys in New York, psychiatrists in New York, said, well, let's try it in a controlled fashion. And in this case study of 4 individuals, guess what? Controlled doses of THC reduced all their symptoms to the degree that they were able to go back and live normal lives, right? So it's not at all clear what's going on with this. And some of the really interesting sort of basic biological research about schizophrenia shows that there are significant differences in endocannabinoid system functioning in people with schizophrenia. There's a lot more anandamide in the cerebral spinal fluid of folks with schizophrenia. So there are some biological mechanisms involved. Again, we don't understand what schizophrenia even is or how it comes to be or what's happening, but there's some exciting indications that the ECS may be a therapeutic target.
Yeah, this is so much more research is needed here. I want to kind of circle back. I think there's something really important that you said there, that with the controlled doses of THC, these 4 subjects, which is of course not enough subjects in the study, but these 4 subjects, were able to kind of return to normal functioning. The controlled doses, I suppose, is really the point here, that, without the education and the research, I think that it's very difficult to self-medicate, especially if you're in a situation where you're buying cannabis on the black market and you have no idea what you're buying. The research look into specifically what types of cannabis and what doses are most effective for these conditions?
No,
Right.
not at all. Right. And yes, this is a critical factor. So much of the research that we have is so broad and poorly defined. People, again, population-wide studies where they're analyzing thousands and thousands of individuals who merely answered, yes, I used cannabis, right? No idea what, no idea how much. There are some attempts to parse how quote unquote heavy a user they are, but the measures are so broad and ill-defined that they're effectively meaningless. And likewise, the differences in dosing, we know. I mean, there are paradoxical dose-dependent effects. One dose may relieve anxiety. A higher dose may induce anxiety of exactly the same substance, right? And cannabis is not alone in that, but it's particularly marked with that. So we definitely need more careful research on exactly what might help with folks. And, there are some exciting things being done on the genetic side of things, right, where we're trying to analyze genomes of plants and people and figure out how they might match up.
Right. Well, definitely waiting with bated breath on that, but I'm assuming it's going to be a few years at least until we have any real takeaways there. Well, look, this is just a quick one at the end of our episode, but as we were saying before we started recording, I would love to get you on the podcast to kind of pull this topic apart, in more depth. So we'll definitely set that up. Any kind of, real takeaways here from what you've been finding out, apart from, the standard more research is needed, that we can leave off with today?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that part of what medical professionals struggle with is that they're operating within a harm paradigm. Cannabis use is not just a comorbidity, it's a harmful behavior, and everything is focused on trying to help people not do it versus any kind of understanding of how it might actually be helpful for people. Analysis of research funding in the United States finds, 20 times more money spent on identifying harms than identifying anything useful. And we still have almost no medical training available to doctors on the potential for cannabinoid medicines or even the endocannabinoid system. So that's a huge lift that we need to accomplish before we can really talk about fully integrating this.
Yeah, definitely. Education keeps coming down to education, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for this, and we're going to talk again soon.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elaine. Bye.
All right. Thanks.
I'm Alana Goldberg. This episode of the Cannabis Enigma podcast was executive produced by myself, with production assistance from Dr. Cody Peterson and Ed Weissman, and edited by our friends at We Edit Podcasts. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to like, rate, and share. It helps other people find the podcast, and it's really nice for us as well.